The Great Australian Gold Robbery. Mid-19th century Australia was not a settled society in the modern sense, nor was it governed with the reach or consistency later generations would assume. It was a landscape of distance and fragmentation, where authority existed strongly in pockets and weakly in the vast spaces between them. The discovery of gold in 1851 transformed this already unstable colonial environment into something far more volatile. Within a matter of years, the population surged, drawn not by stability but by opportunity. Men arrived from Britain, Ireland, Europe, China, and America. Many with little more than tools, ambition, and a willingness to endure hardship in the hope of sudden wealth. Settlements expanded rapidly, often without infrastructure. Tracks became roads, tents became towns, and wealth moved constantly across terrain that could not be controlled. Gold was the central force reshaping the colonies, but it was also the central vulnerability. The wealth extracted from the diggings did not remain in place. It had to be transported by escort, by coach, by mounted carriers across long and exposed routes toward major centres such as Sydney. These movements created predictable opportunities. A shipment of gold was not abstract wealth. It was physical, compact, and immensely valuable. A single successful robbery could yield more than years of labor. In such an environment, crime was not merely an aberration, it was an alternative economy. Bushranging must be understood as a structural phenomenon. It arose from the intersection of geography, opportunity, and social dislocation. The Australian bush offered concealment and mobility. Sparse settlement patterns meant that large areas were effectively unpoliced. Communication between authorities was slow, and response times were often measured in days rather than hours. Men who knew the terrain could move with freedom, particularly if they had support networks among settlers or other outlaws. Many bushrangers were shaped directly by the penal system. Transportation had brought tens of thousands of convicts to Australia. And although the system formally declined by the 1850s, its legacy remained embedded in colonial society. Former convicts often occupied the margins, facing limited opportunities and persistent suspicion. Some reintegrated successfully, but others drifted between employment and criminality. The skills required for survival in the bush endurance and resourcefulness were often the same skills developed under penal conditions. At the same time, not all bushrangers were former convicts. The gold rush created a class of men who had tasted instability and opportunity simultaneously. For some, bushranging became a calculated decision rather than a desperate act. It offered risk, but also the possibility of rapid gain. Colonial authorities were aware of the threat, but their capacity to respond was limited. Police forces were small and under-resourced, and often poorly coordinated. Mounted patrols could cover distance, but they were few in number. Intelligence relied heavily on informants, who were unreliable and frequently motivated by self-interest. In many cases, bushveteran and police plåkar them. This imbalance allowed bushranging to persist despite increasing efforts to suppress it. Within this broader context emerged the individuals who would become central to the great gold robbery. Their lives intersected at a particular moment shaped by circumstance, personality, and opportunity. Frank Gardiner is not a novice. By the time of the robbery, he had already established himself within the criminal landscape of the colony. His early life was marked by movement and instability, and his criminal record suggests a progression from minor offenses to more organized activity. Gardiner was not simply opportunistic. He demonstrated an ability to plan, to assess risk, and to coordinate others. Contemporary accounts portray him as composed and deliberate. He was not prone to unnecessary display. His authority derived less from spectacle and more from control. There is consistent evidence that Gardiner commanded a level of respect or fear among his associates. This distinction is important. Respect implies voluntary recognition, while fear implies coercion. In Gardiner's case, the two appear intertwined. Men followed him because he was capable, but also because he was not easily challenged. In a group where each member was armed and accustomed to risk, leadership depended on more than planning. It required the ability to assert dominance without constant conflict. Ben Hall's trajectory into bushranging differs in significant ways. Unique Gardiner as a self. He acquired land, established himself within the colonial economy, and for a time lived within the expectations of lawful society. His transition into outlawry was not immediate but gradual, shaped by a series of pressures that eroded his position. Financial difficulties, combined with increasing suspicion from authorities, placed him in a precarious situation. Once he came under police attention, the possibility of returning to ordinary life diminished. Primary accounts suggest that Hall's involvement was not purely driven by ideology or defiance. It was also a response to circumstance. Once associated with known criminals, he became subject to surveillance and harassment. This, in turn, limited his ability to operate legitimately. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Suspicion led to marginalization, which led to further involvement in crime. Physically, Hall was not in ideal condition for the demands of bushranging. Contemporary references to a weakness or injury in his leg appear consistently across sources. While the exact nature of the injury is not always clear, its impact is evident. Mobility is critical in both attack and escape, and any limitation would affect a man's role within a group. This detail becomes relevant when examining the robbery, where Hall's position reflects both his capabilities and standing within the group. Other members, including John Gilbert and John Dunn, contributed to the group's overall capacity for action. Gilbert, in particular, was noted for his boldness and willingness to engage directly in confrontation. He appears in several accounts as one of the more aggressive participants, a man prepared to use violence. Dunn, younger and less experienced, was part of the network that supported bushranging operations. The relationships between these men were not static. They formed and dissolved alliances based on opportunity and necessity. Loyalty existed, but it was conditional. In a world where survival depended on quick decisions, long-term stability was rare. The planning of the great gold robbery must be understood within this context of fluid association and calculated risk. The targeter, Gold Escort, was not chosen randomly. Escorts followed known routes, operated on predictable schedules, and carried significant wealth. However, they were also guarded, and any attack carried the risk of armed resistance. Success required more than courage. It required coordination, timing, and a willingness to engage in violence if necessary. The location at Eugowra Rocks was selected with clear intent. The terrain offered natural advantages, including cover and restricted movement. An escort passing through such an area would be vulnerable, particularly if taken by surprise. The gang's decision to act there indicates both knowledge of the route and an understanding of how to exploit it. By the time the robbery was set in motion, the elements were in place, a valuable target and a capable group. A leader was prepared to direct the operation. What remained was execution. By June of 1862, the conditions necessary for one of the most significant robberies in colonial Australia had converged. The goldfields were producing immense wealth, and the vulnerabilities of the escort system were understood by those willing to exploit them. The gang led by Frank Gardiner chose their moment carefully, not through chance, but through observation and preparation. The target was a government gold escort travelling from the Forbes goldfields towards Sydney, carrying both gold and banknotes. It was a mobile concentration of wealth, moving through terrain that could not be fully secured. Eugowra Rocks, the chosen site, was not merely a convenient location. It was tactically advantageous. The road passed through broken country, where large granite outcrops and irregular ground created natural concealment. Movement through such terrain was restricted. Visibility was limited. An escort entering that space would be forced into a narrower corridor of movement, reducing its ability to maneuver. These were not accidental features. They were the basis of the plan. Accounts suggest that the gang positioned themselves in advance, concealed among the rocks and vegetation. They were armed and prepared for resistance. This is an important point. The robbery was not conceived as a passive interception, but as an armed confrontation. The possibility of violence was anticipated. The escort itself consisted of mounted police and civilian guards, accompanying wagons carrying the gold. The men involved were not unarmed couriers. They were expected to defend the cargo if necessary. However, their vulnerability lay in predictability. Routes and schedules were known well enough to anticipate their movements. The gang's success depended on this predictability. When the escort entered the ambush zone at Eugowra Rocks, the initial advantage lay entirely with the bushrangers. They controlled the terrain, the timing, and the element of surprise. At a chosen moment, the attack began. The opening phase of the ambush was rapid and decisive. Shots were fired almost immediately, aimed at disabling the escort's capacity to respond. Contemporary accounts differ in detail, but there is consistent agreement that the initial volley created confusion and disarray among the escort. Horses were startled, men were thrown into defensive positions, and the cohesion of the group was disrupted. One primary account from a member of the escort later described the moment as sudden and disorienting. The firing commenced before any warning could be given, and the men were obliged to act without direction. This lack of coordinated response was precisely what the Bushrangers intended. By striking quickly, they prevented the escort from organizing an effective defense. The question of who fired and to what extent becomes central at this point. Gardiners later claimed that one member of the gang did not fire and therefore did not deserve a share must be considered against the broader evidence. Multiple accounts indicate that several bushrangers discharged their weapons during the attack. The extent of each individual's participation is less clear, partly due to the chaotic nature of the event and partly due to conflicting testimonies given after the fact. It is certain, however, that shots were fired with intent to incapacitate. Members of the escort were wounded. Some accounts suggest that multiple individuals sustained gunshot injuries, though fatalities remain a matter of some dispute in historical sources. The level of violence was sufficient to overcome resistance. The escort, faced with an aggressive assault, was unable to maintain control. John Gilbert is frequently identified as one of the more active participants in the firing. His reputation for boldness aligns with descriptions of the attack, which required individuals willing to engage directly. Whether he was solely responsible for specific injuries cannot be stated with certainty, but his presence in the front line of the ambush is well supported. The role of Alexander Fordyce, who Gardiner later accused of not firing, is more ambiguous. If Gardiner's claim was accurate, it would suggest that at least one member of the gang remained passive during the critical phase. The absence of recorded conflict suggests either that the claim was accepted as true, or that it was not challenged due to Gardiner's authority. In either case, the incident reinforces the perception of Gardiner as the dominant figure within the group. While the main assault unfolded, Ben Hall's role remained peripheral. Hall was positioned with the horses rather than directly engaged. This assignment was practical, ensuring that the gang retained mobility for escape. Hall, despite his later notoriety, was performing a supporting function. The securing of the gold followed the suppression of resistance. Once the escort had been neutralized, the gang moved to seize the cargo. The gold and banknotes were transferred from the escort to the possession of the bushrangers with speed and coordination. The value of the whole has been consistently estimated at over £14,000, representing a significant concentration of wealth. It was not merely a successful robbery. It was an extraordinary one. The scale of the theft ensured immediate attention from colonial authorities. During this phase, control remained with Gardiner. There is no evidence of disorder or internal conflict during the execution. Once the gold was secured, the gang withdrew from the scene. The withdrawal was not a panicked flight, but a managed retreat. Horses, held ready by Hall, enabled rapid movement. The choice to disperse reflects an understanding of the risks associated with pursuit. A single group would be easier to track. Multiple smaller groups could move more unpredictably. The immediate aftermath of the robbery at the site itself was marked by damage and disarray. The escort, having been overpowered, was left to recover and report the incident. Wounded men required attention. The loss of the gold was both a practical and symbolic blow. It represented not only the theft of wealth, but the exposure of vulnerability within the colonial system. Reports were transmitted as quickly as possible, but even this process illustrates the limitations of the time. Communication depended on physical movement riders carrying messages across distance. By the time authorities began to organize a response, the bushrangers had already gained a significant head start. In the days following the robbery, the scale of the event became widely known. Newspapers reported the incident with a mixture of alarm and fascination. The amount taken, the audacity of the attack, and the failure of the escort to prevent it combined to create a narrative that extended beyond the immediate region. The robbery was not perceived as a routine crime. It was an event that challenged the authority of the colonial government. Within the gang, the division of the proceeds became the next critical phase. It is here that Gardiner's leadership and dominance became most evident. Accounts indicate that the gold was divided unevenly, with Gardiner taking a substantially larger share. His justification was based on participation and contribution. Those who had not engaged fully, particularly in the violence of the attack, were deemed less deserving. This rationale reflects a functional logic within the context of bushranging. Risk and reward were directly linked. However, the implementation of this logic depended on authority. This reinforces the interpretation of him as a figure whose authority extended beyond planning into the realm of personal control. He was not merely first among equals. He was the central figure whose decisions shaped outcomes. The individual denied a share on the grounds of not firing occupies a particularly revealing position in this dynamic. If he accepted the decision without resistance, it suggests recognition of Gardiner's authority or awareness of the consequences of defiance. Il n'était cas the inner scontantrevdu. Ben Hall's share, while significant, did not reflect leadership of the operation. His role, constrained by both physical condition and situational hierarchy, placed him within the group, but not at its center during this event. His role was constrained by situational hierarchy during this event. This distinction is important when considering later representations of Hall, which often elevate his role beyond what contemporary evidence supports in the context of this robbery. The gang's dispersal following the division of the gold marked the transition from action to evasion. The challenge now was to avoid capture in the face of an increasingly determined response from authorities. The ambush at Eugowra Rocks stands as a clear example of calculated bushranging at its most effective. It combined planning, terrain advantage, coordinated action, and decisive leadership. It also revealed the limitations of colonial systems that were not equipped to respond quickly to such events. At its center was Frank Gardiner, whose control over both the execution of the robbery and the distribution of its proceeds illustrates a level of authority that shaped not only the outcome of the event, but the behavior of those around him. The violence of the ambush, the questions surrounding participation, and the acceptance of Gardiner's decisions all point to a structure in which leadership was not merely organizational but personal. The robbery was complete. The gold was gone. What followed would determine the fate of the men who had taken it. After the robbery at Eugowra Rocks, the balance of advantage still lay with the bushrangers. They had planned their escape as carefully as the ambush itself. Horses had been positioned in advance, routes considered, and the necessity of dispersal understood. What followed was a deliberate fragmentation. Each man or small group moved separately into the surrounding country, carrying portions of the stolen gold. This decision complicated any immediate pursuit. There was no single trail to follow, no single body of riders to track. Instead, there were multiple directions and a vast landscape in which to disappear. For the colonial authorities, the scale of the robbery demanded a swift response. The theft of such gold represented a direct challenge to authority. Rewards were quickly announced, and descriptions of the suspects circulated through official channels and the press. Police units across the colony were alerted. Mounted troopers were dispatched. The pursuit began, but it began at a disadvantage. Communication remained a central limitation. News of the robbery traveled by rider, and even under urgency, there were delays. The bushrangers had already moved far beyond the immediate vicinity. The terrain itself compounded the problem. Tracks branched and disappeared, waterways interrupted trails, and dense bushland provided cover. Initial efforts focused on the most likely routes. Police anticipated that the gang would move toward known bushranging refuges. Within the gang, dispersal did not eliminate all connection. Some members regrouped temporarily, sharing information before separating again. This network of informal sympathy played a rôle. Settlers were not always inclined to assist the authorities. Frank Gardiner's movements illustrate both caution and confidence. He did not remain in one place long, avoiding predictable routes. His share of the gold was substantial. Transporting such wealth required planning. It could not be carried indefinitely without increasing the risk. Gardiner maintained a composure that distinguished him from his associates. Where others acted impulsively, he was more restrained. The police response intensified. Patrols were extended, and known associates were questioned. Authorities understood that pursuit alone was not enough. Information was essential. This shifted attention toward informants. The use of informants was a long-standing feature, but it carried difficulties. Sorting useful intelligence from noise required judgment. Despite these challenges, the pressure began to produce results. Leads emerged. Certain movements were tracked. Encounters occurred brief and often inconclusive, but indicative that the distance between pursuers and pursued was narrowing. One of the key difficulties for the bushrangers was the need to convert or conceal their stolen wealth. Gold and banknotes could not be openly used without risk. Attempting to exchange or spend them increased the likelihood of exposure. This necessity forced some members into situations where they had to interact with others, creating opportunities for recognition or betrayal. As weeks passed, the cohesion of the original group diminished further. The shared objective, the robbery, had been achieved. What remained was individual survival. In Tisfaz, Din's temperament, experience, and judgment became more pronounced. Some men adapted effectively to the demands of evasion. Others did not. Arrests began to occur. They were not the result of a single decisive breakthrough, but of accumulated pressure. A sighting here, a piece of information there, each contributed to the gradual dismantling of the network. Once a member of the gang, was captured, the potential for further information increased. Knowledge began to flow back toward the authorities. John Gilbert remained at large for a time, but became increasingly exposed. His continued involvement in bushranging activity drew attention. Frank Gardiner, whose more extractions kept him within the sphere of active pursuit. John Dunn, younger and less experienced, was similarly vulnerable. Youth did not confer the same capacity for caution. His movements and decisions placed him at risk. Over time, this risk translated into capture. Ben Hall's position is more complex. His association with known bushrangers ensured that he remained under scrutiny. Police attention toward him intensified. Hall's familiarity with the bush allowed him to evade capture, but under increasing pressure, the broader policing strategy evolved. Authorities sought to anticipate movement. Known routes and watering points were monitored more closely. Cooperation between different police units improved, though constrained by the realities of distance and communication. The introduction of systematic tracking methods also played a role. Experienced Aboriginal trackers were employed to follow signs others might miss. Footprints and subtle indicators of passage became part of the investigative process, increasing the likelihood of locating those hidden. Despite these efforts, Frank Gardiner continued to evade capture through caution, planning, and a willingness to withdraw. Unlike his associates, he did not continue to draw attention. This reduction in visibility made him a more difficult target. There are indications that Gardiner may have begun to consider departure from the colony. Wealth and pressure created the incentive to leave. Having secured a significant share of the gold, the logical objective was to preserve it, not to risk it through continued exposure. The fragmentation of the gang led to individual outcomes. Each member faced a different trajectory, shaped by circumstance and decision. Some were captured and brought to trial. Others were killed in encounters with police. A few managed to reshape their paths. For authorities, the pursuit was about restoring confidence. Allowing those responsible to remain at large would reinforce a perception of vulnerability. Each arrest, each confirmed death was significant, not only in practical terms, but in symbolic ones. Public attention remained focused on the case. Newspapers continued to report developments, often with limited or conflicting information. The narrative of the robbery, already dramatic, became intertwined with the unfolding pursuit. Accounts of sightings, near captures, and confrontations contributed to a broader story that extended beyond the immediate facts. Within this narrative, the figure of Frank Gardiner retained a central position. His role in organizing the robbery, combined with his continued freedom, reinforced his status as the primary target. The fact that he had taken the largest share of the gold only intensified this focus. He was not merely a participant, he was the man who had benefited the most. At the same time, the outcomes for other members of the gang began to diverge more sharply. As arrests accumulated, the likelihood of coordinated resistance diminished. Those still at large operated increasingly in isolation. The pursuit phase represents a transition from collective action to individual consequence. The robbery had been a moment of coordination. The aftermath was characterized by fragmentation, pressure, and the gradual imposition of authority. For some, the end would come quickly. For others, it would be delayed but no less decisive. And for Gardiner, the question remained whether his planning and restraint would carry him beyond the reach of the system he had so effectively challenged. By the time the pursuit entered its later phase, the robbery itself had receded into the past as an event. But it remained active as a consequence. What had begun as a single, coordinated act at Eugowra Rocks unfolded into a prolonged process of apprehension, confrontation, and, ultimately, resolution through force and the courts. The colonial authorities, having been exposed by the scale and success of the robbery, could not afford to allow its perpetrators to remain indefinitely at large. The pressure applied during the pursuit began to produce final outcomes, and those outcomes were neither uniform nor simultaneous. Each member of the gang faced a different end, shaped by his own actions and the circumstances that eventually closed around him. John Gilbert's trajectory illustrates the risks inherent in continued activity. Frank Gardiner imaging. This decision placed him repeatedly in situations where confrontation with police became increasingly likely. His reputation for boldness, which had contributed to the success of the robbery, also contributed to his exposure. He was not a man inclined toward withdrawal or concealment for extended periods. Instead, he continued to operate in a manner that drew attention. The confrontation that ended Gilbert's life occurred in 1865, several years after the robbery, but directly within the broader arc of events it had set in motion. Police, acting on information and sustained tracking efforts, located Gilbert in the bush near Binalong. The encounter was brief and decisive. Gilbert was shot and killed during the confrontation. Accounts indicate that he did not surrender. His death marked the end of one of the more aggressive figures associated with the robbery and subsequent bushranging activity. Gilbert's death also reflects the evolving strategy of colonial policing. Authorities were more prepared to use lethal force when necessary. The declaration of certain individuals as outlaws formalized this shift, allowing police to act with greater latitude, reducing the constraints that might otherwise have governed arrest procedures. In practice, this meant that encounters were more likely to end in death than capture. John Dunn's fate followed a different path. Younger and less experienced, Dunn was eventually captured and brought to trial. His arrest represents the cumulative effect of sustained pressure and the increasing difficulty of remaining concealed as the network of bushrangers fragmented. Once in custody, Dunn became part of the formal legal process, subject to trial and sentencing. Trial records and contemporary reports indicate that the proceedings were conducted within the framework of colonial law, but they were also influenced by the broader context. The robbery at Eugowra Rocks, the subsequent bushranging activities, and the public attention surrounding these events created an environment in which the outcome was, if not predetermined, then heavily weighted. Dunn was found guilty and executed in 1866. His execution served both as punishment and as a statement. It demonstrated that the authorities retained the capacity to impose ultimate penalties even after initial failures. Ben Hall's End occupies a particularly prominent place in the narrative, partly due to his later reputation and partly due to the circumstances of his death. By 1865, Hall had been declared an outlaw under legislation that allowed for his killing without the usual judicial process. This legal status reflects the extent to which authorities had shifted their approach. Hall was no longer to be apprehended and tried. He was to be eliminated. The circumstances of Hall's death have been the subject of considerable discussion. Police, acting on information regarding his location, ambushed him near Forbes. Accounts suggest that Hall was surprised and shot multiple times. There is no indication that he was given an opportunity to surrender. The encounter was not a confrontation in the conventional sense. It was an execution carried out under the authority granted by his outlaw status. This manner of death reinforces the perception of Hall as a figure who had moved beyond the reach of ordinary law. It also highlights the degree to which the authorities were prepared to act decisively in order to conclude the pursuit. Hall's earlier role in the robbery, while not central in terms of leadership, had nonetheless tied him to a chain of events that ultimately led to this outcome. Frank Gardiner's fate stands in contrast to those of his associates. While others were killed or captured, Gardiner succeeded in avoiding immediate apprehension. His movements following the robbery suggest a deliberate effort to disengage from active bushranging and to secure his position. The substantial share of the gold he retained provided both the means and the motivation to leave the colony. Gardiner eventually departed Australia, travelling to regions beyond the immediate reach of colonial authorities. Reports indicate that he spent time in places such as California, where he lived under his own name or aliases, maintaining a relatively low profile. His escape represents a divergence from the pattern experienced by others. While the system captured many participants, it did not achieve complete resolution. The fact that Gardiner retained a significant portion of the stolen wealth adds a further dimension to his outcome. The robbery, in his case, achieved its primary objective. He secured the gold and avoided the consequences that befell others. This does not diminish the risks he faced, but it does highlight the uneven distribution of outcomes within the group. The internal dynamics of the gang, particularly Gardiner's dominance, become more significant when viewed in light of these outcomes. His control during the robbery and his decision to take the largest share point to a hierarchy that extended beyond the moment of action. That hierarchy influenced not only the distribution of wealth, but also the trajectories that followed. The individual Gardiner accused of not firing and, therefore, denied her share remains a revealing figure within this structure. If Gardiner's claim was accurate, it reflects a system in which participation in violence was directly linked to reward. If the claim was inaccurate, his acceptance of the decision suggests that Gardiner's authority was sufficient to suppress disagreement. In such a context, leadership is not merely a matter of coordination, it is a matter of control. Gardiner's ability to direct actions and assign roles without recorded resistance supports the conclusion that he was not to be challenged lightly. This perception would have influenced behavior during the robbery. The division of the gold and the subsequent period of dispersal the broader implications of the robbery extend beyond the individuals involved. For the authorities, the event prompted reflection on the escort system. Adjustments were made, both in terms of security for gold transports and in the organization of police forces. While these changes did not eliminate bushranging, they contributed to its gradual decline by reducing large-scale robbery opportunities. Public perception of bushrangers, however, did not align entirely with official perspectives. Newspapers reported on events with a mixture of condemnation and fascination. The scale of the robbery, the audacity of the attack, and the prolonged pursuit created a narrative that captured attention. Over time, this narrative contributed to a complex image of bushrangers combining elements of criminality, defiance, and, in some cases, reluctant admiration. It is important to separate this narrative from the realities. The robbery at Eugowra Rocks was not an act of rebellion or social protest. It was a calculated crime carried out for material gain. The violence involved was not symbolic. It was functional, intended to secure the objective. The internal dynamics of the group were not egalitarian. They were hierarchical, shaped by authority and, at times, intimidation. The deaths of Gilbert and Hall, the execution of Dunn, and the escape of Gardiner represent different outcomes within the same framework. Each reflects a combination of individual decision-making and systemic response. Together, they form the concluding phase of the event. In assessing the Great Gold Robbery, it is necessary to consider both its immediate impact and its longer-term significance. In practical terms, it exposed weaknesses in colonial systems and prompted responses that altered those systems. In human terms, it demonstrated the variability of outcomes within a group bound by a shared act, some paid with their lives, some with their freedom. One, at least, secured both wealth and escape. Aide Centre, the Frank Gardiner remains critical. His role in planning the robbery made him the defining individual. Gardiner's influence shaped the structure within which those contributions occurred. The Great Australian Gold Robbery endures because it represents a convergence of factors: opportunity, organization, and authority. It reveals the extent to which power can operate outside formal structures, particularly in environments where those structures are incomplete. In the end, the robbery was not simply about gold. It was about control of movement, of men, and of outcome. And, for a brief period, that control lay not with the authorities, but with the men who took it.